For nearly 60 years, the world has been given a version of how Malcolm X died. A version that fits neatly into textbooks. A version that feels complete. A version that suggests the story ended the moment the gunshots echoed through a Harlem ballroom. But history has a way of smoothing over its most uncomfortable edges. And in this case, what was left out may be more important than what was left in. Because in the final weeks of Malcolm X's life, something invisible to the public was quietly accelerating. His movements were being watched more closely. His meetings drew more attention. His international connections began to reshape how powerful institutions viewed him. To supporters, he was evolving into a global human rights voice. To others, he was becoming unpredictable, harder to contain, harder to categorize, and far more difficult to silence with simple narratives. What most people never hear is that Malcolm X was no longer just part of an American story. He was stepping onto a world stage. In Africa, his message connected deeply with newly independent nations. In Europe, activists followed his speeches with growing interest. In the Middle East, his ideas about dignity, sovereignty, and identity resonated in ways that alarmed officials back in the United States. The civil rights struggle was becoming something bigger, and that shift quietly changed the risks around him. Inside intelligence offices, his name appeared more frequently. Analysts debated not only what he said, but what his influence could become. A man who could link domestic injustice to international pressure was no longer just a speaker. He was a bridge between movements. And throughout modern history, bridges between people and power structures have often made governments deeply uneasy. So when gunfire ended his life, the public was offered a simple explanation. Suspects were named. A story was packaged. The world was told to move on. But beneath that official version, questions never stopped circulating. Why were certain warnings ignored? Why did some evidence vanish into sealed files? Why did people closest to him describe a sense that something larger was unfolding, something they could feel, but could not stop? What if Malcolm X wasn't just the victim of a moment, but the target of a convergence? A convergence of personal conflict, political fear, and global pressure that history was never comfortable fully confronting. What if the assassination was not just an ending, but a turning point that reshaped how power handles voices that grow too influential, too international, too difficult to control? If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover hidden global truths. And tell us, where are you watching from? Because the story of Malcolm X may not just be about the past. It may be a warning about how truth, power, and influence still collide today. In the final weeks before February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was moving through a world that had quietly become more dangerous. On the surface, his public life looked steady: speeches, meetings, organizing. But beneath that calm exterior, the systems that once surrounded him had fractured. After leaving the Nation of Islam, he no longer had the same internal security, the same trusted structure, or the same protective buffer. That loss changed everything. It meant his movements were easier to track. It meant his circle was smaller. And it meant the margin for error had narrowed. What most people are never told is how exposed this made him at a moment when his influence was actually growing. His name appeared more frequently in intelligence files. His travel plans drew quiet attention. His conversations were no longer seen as just political speech, but as potential diplomatic complications. By reframing civil rights as human rights, Malcolm was preparing to take America's racial crisis to an international stage, a move that carried serious consequences for how the United States was viewed abroad. That shift alone placed him in a different category of concern. At the same time, emotional and ideological tensions followed him closely. Former allies viewed him with suspicion. Rumors circulated. Threats were discussed in private. The environment around him became layered with uncertainty, part personal conflict, part political anxiety, part institutional scrutiny. Those closest to Malcolm later said he understood the risks. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost resigned awareness. He was building something new, but he was doing it without the protection that had once surrounded him. What remains haunting is how many warning signs existed, and how few of them were fully understood at the time. Because history often reveals that danger is rarely sudden. It builds slowly, in overlooked details, in broken alliances, and in decisions made behind closed doors. On the morning of February 21, 1965, small irregularities foreshadowed a tragedy that few could yet grasp. Doors opened to the Audubon Ballroom. Supporters arrived. Conversations buzzed with anticipation, but subtle anomalies stood out in hindsight. Security was thinner than usual. Familiar faces were absent. The room carried an edge, almost imperceptible, yet enough to unsettle those who would remember it for the rest of their lives. These were details that would later feel like signs, though at the time, they were easily dismissed. What is rarely revealed in documentaries is how fractured the forces surrounding Malcolm had become. Internal rivalries, lingering resentment, political pressures, and external surveillance converged quietly, layering risk on risk. Alone, each factor might have seemed manageable. Together, they created a fragile environment where one misstep, one moment of chaos, could have irreversible consequences. And when gunfire erupted, the result was swift, shocking, and world-changing. Even as official narratives formed, questions quietly multiplied. Witnesses offered conflicting accounts. Evidence was overlooked or suppressed. Documents were sealed, some for decades. And far beyond the United States, the news was interpreted differently. In parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe, Malcolm's assassination was not just an American story. It was a political signal, a warning about the cost of influence, and a reminder of how global attention can make a domestic life dangerous. In that space between what was reported and what truly happened, the untold story of Malcolm X was beginning to take shape, and the world was already watching. In the hours and days following Malcolm X's assassination, the story rippled far beyond Harlem. Across Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean, activists, students, and political leaders followed the news with a mix of shock and reflection. To many outside the United States, this was not merely a domestic tragedy, it was a moment with global implications. Malcolm had become a symbol of a broader struggle, connecting the fight for civil rights in America to anti-colonial movements and questions of sovereignty worldwide. His death was perceived not only as the silencing of a man, but as an interruption of a conversation that was beginning to challenge established powers everywhere. Behind diplomatic and intelligence walls, reactions were far more cautious, but no less significant. Governments reviewed his international influence, analysts assessed the potential consequences of his absence, and intelligence agencies considered how a once local activist had become a global voice. Some felt relief that a complex figure was no longer active, others feared that his ideas, now untethered, might spread faster than ever. History has shown that eliminating a voice can paradoxically amplify it. Across continents, Malcolm's assassination began to fuel debates, inspire movements, and challenge assumptions in ways that mere speeches could not. Yet publicly, the narrative was tightly controlled. News coverage emphasized suspects, motives, and timelines, while the deeper global repercussions were left unexamined. Analysts outside the U.S. recognized patterns familiar from other parts of the world, where challenging powers often comes with personal risk and institutional suppression. In this space between the official story and international perception, a deeper tension emerged. The more the narrative appeared closed, the more complex, unsettling, and incomplete the truth became. The world had noticed, and it was asking questions that authorities were not ready to answer. As the days turned into weeks, the implications of Malcolm X's assassination became clearer, not through official channels, but in quiet, far-reaching ways. In Africa, young leaders cited his speeches as inspiration for political and social reform. In Europe, activist circles debated how a single man's death could illuminate systemic oppression beyond U.S. borders. His ideas had traveled faster than any official narrative, infiltrating conversations that authorities had hoped would remain isolated. And with each mention, the gap between the story presented to the public and the reality of his influence widened. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies and political institutions quietly re-evaluated the networks and alliances Malcolm had built. Meetings were convened, files scrutinized, and connections traced across continents. What was once seen as a domestic activist now represented a potential catalyst for international scrutiny, and that recognition was enough to unsettle officials who preferred order over challenge. In this shadow world, observers realized that removing Malcolm X did not erase the ideas he had set in motion. It only forced them into channels that were harder to predict, harder to contain, and potentially more dangerous. Public attention, meanwhile, focused on individuals rather than the systemic forces at play. Headlines emphasized blame and closure while avoiding the deeper questions about power, influence, and surveillance that haunted those who had been closest to him. Yet internationally, his death sparked curiosity, debate, and reflection, proof that voices, even when silenced, can ripple outward in ways that history cannot fully control. The assassination was not merely a moment in time, it was a turning point, one whose consequences would quietly echo across borders for decades to come. Decades later, the story of Malcolm X still feels incomplete, not because of missing headlines, but because of what remained hidden behind closed doors. Intelligence files, internal memos, and personal accounts hint at layers of complexity that were never meant for public view. Who watched him most closely? Who profited from the silence that followed? And why did some evidence vanish while other details were amplified? These are the questions that historians, journalists, and curious observers continue to ask, long after the final shots were fired. The human dimension of the untold story is equally compelling. Friends and family describe a man who moved with both courage and calculated awareness. He understood the risks, yet he persisted, building connections and shaping ideas that extended far beyond his immediate surroundings. His absence left a vacuum, but his influence did not fade. It traveled through conversations, speeches, and movements that crossed oceans. In that sense, the files that remain sealed are more than bureaucratic artifacts. They are reminders of a truth too complex, too uncomfortable, and too far-reaching to fit neatly into a single narrative. And yet, even with these unanswered questions, the story continues to teach. It reminds the world that power often operates in shadows, that voices capable of bridging nations are both celebrated and feared, and that the full measure of influence is rarely captured in official reports. Malcolm X's life and the ambiguity surrounding his death challenges each generation to ask, when a voice disappears, who benefits, and what do we lose in silence? As the years passed, researchers and historians uncovered fragments of the truth, each detail raising more questions than it answered. Sealed documents, conflicting witness statements, and hidden surveillance logs suggested a network of influence that extended far beyond Harlem. What really happened in those final moments, and who truly shaped the aftermath? These unanswered mysteries have become part of Malcolm X's legacy, a legacy that refuses to be confined to official narratives or simplified explanations. The emotional resonance of his story lingers in ways that transcend politics. Communities around the world continue to reflect on what his life and death signify: the fragility of challenging entrenched power, the courage required to speak uncomfortable truths, and the ways in which ideas can survive even when the messenger is gone. In classrooms, in activist circles, and in private conversations, Malcolm's voice continues to inspire debate, reflection, and action, proving that silence cannot fully erase influence. And so the untold story remains unfinished, not because it cannot be told, but because it is still alive, in the questions it provokes, the lessons it carries, and the enduring reminder that truth is often layered, complicated, and stubbornly persistent. What the files hide may never be fully revealed, yet the echoes of his life ripple across generations, nations, and movements, urging us to look deeper, question more, and remember that history is rarely as simple as it appears. Malcolm X's story reminds us that truth often lives in shadows, shaped by power, fear, and silence. What is recorded tells only part of the tale, while the unseen shapes generations and movements. His life and death echo far beyond Harlem, inspiring reflection across nations. Even in silence, his ideas travel, challenging the narratives we accept and the histories we preserve. Ultimately, the untold story asks us to look closer, question deeper, and remember that influence cannot be silenced. History is never simple. It is a mirror, reflecting who we are and what we choose to remember.